Walter and Joan Gray had spent most of their lives avoiding unnecessary complications. Practical, calm, and intentional in every aspect of their lives, they had never chased attention or drama. Their decision to move into a new suburban home was driven not by charm or curb appeal, but by structure. The location offered stable utilities, strong zoning records, and a well-documented community layout. For Walter, a freelance consultant in corporate risk management, and Joan, who curated a successful online art gallery, it was a place where they could work uninterrupted, maintain their routines, and enjoy the kind of quiet predictability they valued. They weren't interested in block parties, neighborhood committees, or casual drop-ins. They liked things orderly, and they assumed this neighborhood would be just that. From the very beginning, everything seemed aligned with their expectations, until Walter noticed an odd pattern in the data usage reports. Their internet provider offered a detailed breakdown of network activity, and for 2 nights in a row, something didn't add up. The system was showing data being uploaded at volumes far above what either of them ever used. Initially, Walter thought it might be a cloud sync error. Maybe one of their devices had defaulted to automatic backups. He checked their home server, looked over the devices connected to their network, reset permissions, and ran a few quiet system diagnostics. But the patterns continued, steady and deliberate, like someone had established a schedule inside their own home. He didn't say anything to Joan at first. There was no need to alarm her over what might turn out to be a technical bug. Still, Walter changed their Wi-Fi credentials, ran a full security update on all networked equipment, and configured the firewall to block unrecognized mouse addresses. But despite his precautions, the next morning revealed a new set of connection attempts. Sophisticated ones, using masking techniques and device names designed to blend in with common household tech. It wasn't just an intrusion. It was calculated access, routed through specific channels that shouldn't have existed. Walter began to suspect that their network had been tapped, not from outside, but from somewhere within their property. When he cut off all external traffic to stop the unknown devices, a subtle chain of events unfolded. That same afternoon, they received a strangely timed call from the local management office, asking whether their service was functioning properly. The tone was warm and professional, but the question felt out of place. Walter hadn't submitted any service ticket, hadn't mentioned a thing. The only way anyone would even know their connection was offline was if they had been using it. Walter had never been one for conspiracy theories or dramatic leaps in logic. His instincts were shaped by years of analyzing systemic vulnerabilities in corporate operations, where the smallest inconsistency often pointed to a larger flaw in protocol. So when the odd traffic on their home network turned out to be persistent, masked, and actively resistant to disconnection, he knew better than to chalk it up to coincidence. Still, he hadn't expected to find anything physically connected to their property. That possibility only occurred to him when a small but unusual delay occurred during a routine firmware update on their main router. A separate terminal on his monitoring rig registered a handshake attempt that didn't match any known local device, but the signal strength suggested proximity far closer than a neighboring home. That was the moment when suspicion took on weight, and Walter decided it was time to verify the physical wiring. Something most people never think twice about once they move into a new home. He didn't crawl through crawl spaces or start prying into walls like some overzealous amateur. Instead, he contacted a licensed independent technician from a reputable local firm, requesting a private consultation under the guise of a signal optimization check. The technician, a soft-spoken man in his 30s, brought a signal tracer, spectrum analyzer, and a curious expression when Walter walked him through the pattern of unusual connectivity. Within 20 minutes of testing signal paths, the technician's demeanor changed. He found something he didn't expect: a cable split in the main wall conduit, expertly integrated with the existing system, but diverging through a reinforced track that bypassed the usual modem access point. The technician carefully followed the wiring path through the house's built-in infrastructure, eventually tracing it to the far side of the basement, where a discrete junction box had been embedded behind a paneled storage cabinet. Inside the box, there was a high-frequency signal booster and what appeared to be a commercial-grade relay, a device typically used in corporate environments to extend wireless range securely over large areas. The technician looked at Walter with a mixture of disbelief and caution, explaining that someone had installed a point-to-point relay capable of broadcasting and receiving high-bandwidth signals, likely connected to an off-site receiver or mesh node. More importantly, the cable running from that device exited the house through a discreet underground conduit that appeared to head in the direction of the neighborhood's administrative building. None of this equipment was standard for residential properties. It wasn't amateur work, and it hadn't been installed after the Grays moved in. It was embedded into the infrastructure, wired into the property as if it belonged. Joan, upon hearing about it, was visibly shaken. She had assumed, as most would, that when you purchase a home, the walls are yours. But now they were standing in a house that had been used without their consent or knowledge as a silent digital relay hub. Walter photographed every component, documented serial numbers, and had the technician provide a brief written summary of his findings before disconnecting the booster and physically removing the external cable from their system. The technician, upon leaving, offered one final observation that lingered with Walter. He'd seen similar configurations before, but never in a private residence, and never without official licensing. It wasn't just about bandwidth theft anymore. This was unauthorized access infrastructure, routed through private property and possibly violating multiple privacy laws. The following morning, they received a formal letter from the neighborhood office slipped under their door. Hand-delivered, not mailed. It was printed on heavy stock, worded with passive-aggressive cordiality, and signed by someone they had not yet met. Karen Jennings, Community Liaison Supervisor. The letter expressed concern about recent disruptions to community-wide connectivity protocols and requested that the Grays avoid interfering with shared services until a formal assessment can be scheduled. Joan read the letter twice, eyes narrowing, then handed it silently to Walter. Neither of them had ever agreed to any form of communal network sharing agreement. They had no reason to believe that their home was considered part of any such arrangement, and certainly not to the extent of hosting physical infrastructure for it. Yet this letter spoke in the language of entitlement, as if the neighborhood had somehow earned the right to tunnel through their walls without so much as a conversation. Walter's reply wasn't verbal. He drafted an official complaint addressed to their real estate attorney, including full documentation of the wiring, photos, and a request to investigate whether any disclosures had been falsified during their home purchase. He also contacted a regulatory compliance advisor specializing in residential digital privacy, seeking clarification on liability and the legal framework surrounding unauthorized signal routing. It wasn't about drama, it was about drawing the line. And if someone had crossed into their house without permission, digitally or otherwise, they were going to pay for it, in full. Walter didn't expect immediate retaliation for disconnecting the relay device. In fact, for the first 2 days after the removal, everything was quiet. Too quiet. The network traffic returned to normal, the signal stabilized, and no more unknown devices attempted to connect. For a brief moment, he even allowed himself to think that perhaps the matter had been overblown, that maybe the equipment had been some long-forgotten install from a previous owner, left behind and never decommissioned. But that illusion was quickly shattered when their home's smart thermostat stopped responding to commands and locked itself in an unchangeable power-saving mode. Walter, who had configured it himself through a private system not linked to any external provider, knew this wasn't a glitch. The interface was still accessible, but controls were overridden remotely. He hard reset the device only to find the same limitations restored within minutes. At the same time, Joan reported that her gallery website began experiencing aggressive slowdowns, uncharacteristic for her normally well-optimized and locally hosted platform. Diagnostic tests showed that traffic to and from her server was being bottlenecked, not by her own hosting service, but by unusual routing through intermediary nodes. Someone was manipulating the data pathways. Before Walter could fully piece together the implications, they received another letter. This time, not tucked politely under the door, but shoved halfway through the mail slot as if delivered in anger. The envelope bore the same community liaison seal, but this time the tone of the contents was far less courteous. Karen Jennings accused them of violating infrastructure harmonization standards by tampering with authorized network hardware installed as part of the transitional connectivity protocol, and stated that until a review was conducted, their home would be flagged as non-cooperative. The letter included veiled language implying penalties, including administrative fees, community sanctions, and possible legal exposure. What truly disturbed Walter wasn't the threat. It was the boldness with which the letter presumed authority over their property. They were now being treated not as homeowners, but as dissenters against some unwritten digital order. Later that day, a uniformed contractor from a third-party maintenance firm arrived unannounced and attempted to access the backyard, claiming to be conducting signal realignment tests. Joan, visibly shaken, refused him entry and told him to wait, while she contacted their lawyer. The man, seemingly uncomfortable and perhaps realizing he'd stepped into something larger, left without argument. But the message was clear. Pressure was being applied. The same evening, their access credentials to the neighborhood's utility management portal stopped working. That platform allowed residents to schedule waste pickups, track water usage, and manage service tickets. Now, every time they tried to log in, the system rejected their credentials and prompted a message that their account was under review for terms compliance. Walter knew he was being boxed in. They weren't just dealing with technological intrusion. They were being isolated administratively, digitally, and logistically. He expanded his documentation efforts, tracking every lockout, redirect, and error message. He noticed patterns in how service slowdowns and lockouts coincided with key times. When Joan uploaded new gallery pieces, when Walter submitted client reports, when they paid monthly invoices or attempted to update account details. The interference was synchronized and unmistakably deliberate. Still, Walter had no interest in escalating with raw confrontation. He wasn't a man who shouted through fences or made threats in driveways. His approach was methodical. He knew that to dismantle a system like this, you didn't fight it where it was strongest. You waited until it exposed its weak points. Joan, meanwhile, had started noticing something strange in the neighborhood itself. Several homes had small antenna-like structures mounted near their utility boxes. Devices she hadn't seen when they first moved in. At first, she assumed they were smart meters, but upon closer inspection, these units bore no markings, no regulatory stickers, and no branding. One day, while walking their dog, she spotted Karen Jennings talking to two men near one of these installations, gesturing toward the gray house. Joan ducked back behind a hedge before she could be seen, her heart pounding. She snapped a quick photo with her phone. Nothing dramatic, just evidence. That night, they reviewed everything together. Walter laid out the digital traces, the service obstructions, the legal correspondences, and the physical signs. Joan showed him the photo and described what she had overheard in fragments. Karen referring to their house as compromised and uncooperative. They weren't just passive targets in a neighborhood dispute anymore. They were now the subject of active coordination. This wasn't about internet traffic or bandwidth. This was about control. Their house had been drafted into a wider, silent infrastructure, and by refusing to comply, they had triggered a response protocol designed to apply escalating pressure until submission. Still, Walter didn't respond with anger. He reached out instead to a telecommunications regulation expert he had worked with years prior, someone who had consulted for major internet providers on unauthorized signal routing. He also filed a formal complaint with the Public Utilities Commission, citing unauthorized interference with private network devices and requesting a third-party technical audit. They didn't want drama. They wanted accountability. And if this neighborhood thought it could use their property as a digital way station without consent, it was about to learn what happened when two quiet, well-informed people decided they'd had enough. The tipping point came not with a crash or confrontation, but with a quiet report buried in an email thread Walter received from the regulatory advisor he had contacted days earlier. The message included the results of a preliminary scan conducted by a subcontracted diagnostics firm hired to investigate unauthorized signal usage on private properties within the region. The language was clinical, but the implications were glaring. Their house had been functioning as a central node in an unregistered high-bandwidth directional mesh network. Not only that, but the signal strength, frequency behavior, and channel overlap confirmed that data had been routed through their home for weeks, possibly longer, transmitting not just general internet usage, but encrypted administrative packages, typical of remote surveillance and management software. That kind of traffic, coordinated, pulsed, encoded, was far beyond any plausible explanation involving neighborhood resource sharing. It had the markings of a clandestine system operating under the radar of standard service agreements. Walter read the email 3 times, his hands clenched around the edge of the desk as if trying to steady himself against the shift in gravity. They weren't simply being used, they were being exploited. Worse, the implication that encrypted traffic was moving through their network opened legal vulnerability. If traced improperly, they could be mistaken as the source of actions they never initiated. Identity, liability, and digital responsibility were being blurred, masked beneath their roof. Joan, upon hearing this, became silent for nearly an hour. She was a woman of calm intensity, not prone to panic, but there was a hollow look behind her eyes that day. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about the space they lived in, being twisted into something neither of them recognized. That same afternoon, as if coordinated to compound the pressure, a second letter from Karen Jennings arrived. This time hand-delivered and signed in blue ink. It cited their continued non-compliance with community integrated data provisioning, a term so vague it might have passed as bureaucratic gibberish if not for the final paragraph. An official notice that a reassessment of their service tier would be conducted, which could lead to reclassification of their property as a limited access zone. The wording was intentionally convoluted, but Walter understood the implication. They were being marked, digitally isolated, rebranded within the community's internal systems as outliers, not just administratively but functionally. Their access to infrastructure, services, and possibly even digital property records could be throttled or hidden behind permissions walls. They were being digitally exiled without leaving their house. That night, Walter made a decision. He wasn't going to continue playing defense. He pulled up his system interface, reconfigured his internal server environment, and redirected all incoming external connections to a sandboxed virtual machine that mimicked the original setup. Only this time, it was a trap. Any attempt to reroute, inject, or sync data would now be captured and logged. He created dummy traffic, fabricated packages filled with benign but useless information, designed to look authentic but engineered to corrupt the structure of any indexing system attempting to interpret them. It was a passive weapon, not a cyber attack, but a form of digital self-defense designed to scramble the purpose of the network leeching from them. Meanwhile, he filtered all outbound data to prevent any identifying markers from escaping. He didn't want retaliation. He wanted evidence. He needed to know who was behind the mask, who had installed the infrastructure, who had sanctioned it. Joan, at his side, composed a formal letter addressed to their state's Digital Consumer Protection Bureau, citing direct violation of property rights, intrusion into private communication systems, and administrative overreach by the neighborhood management body. They included photographs of the relay equipment, logs from their network analyzer, the technician's findings, and even the vague threat-laden correspondence from Karen. The letter was forwarded not only to the Bureau, but to a local investigative office with jurisdiction over utility oversight. For a while, nothing happened. The neighborhood remained quiet, almost too quiet, as if someone had given orders to go dark. Then, 5 days later, a quiet knock came at their door. Not a delivery, not a contractor, but a man dressed in plain clothes carrying a binder and credentials from a state-level digital infrastructure agency. He had received the forwarded complaint and wanted to speak in person. Walter led him to the basement, showed him the now disconnected panel, the trench where the unauthorized cable had run, and the logs compiled over weeks of tracking. The man was patient, thorough, and took notes on everything. After a long silence, he offered them the first real confirmation they had been waiting for. This wasn't the only property flagged. Others across the region had reported similar setups. Relay systems piggybacked through private homes under the pretense of smart neighborhood integration. But in their case, the level of coordination was unusually high. Someone had not just tapped into their property, they had done so under a framework designed to look legal, leveraging documents and contracts not reviewed during sale. The agency promised a formal audit. In the meantime, Walter's redirected data trap began recording unexpected return signals. Someone was still trying to access the node, unaware it had been replaced. The frequency and aggression of these attempts proved they weren't dealing with a passive system. They were dealing with an entity that relied on control, that demanded consistency, and was now panicking in its absence. Walter knew what was coming next wouldn't be subtle. They'd rattled the system, and soon it would push back. The pushback didn't come as a formal notice or a legal threat. It came through silence, calculated and suffocating. Walter noticed it first when access to their local government property management portal was quietly revoked. Not blocked, not denied, just gone. Their credentials no longer worked, and their property ID returned as unrecognized. The same morning, Joan's online gallery platform received a takedown notice citing a violation of terms related to data origin integrity. The claim was baseless. She hosted her content through a private platform they maintained on an isolated server. But the request had been filed through a third-party monitoring service frequently used by large administrative entities. It was clear someone had gone beyond manipulating infrastructure. Now they were attempting to rewrite the Gray's digital footprint piece by piece. For a moment, Joan stood frozen in front of her desk, mouse still in hand, watching as her website, the one she had built from the ground up, the one that supported her, was pulled offline over a fabricated compliance breach. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply whispered, "They're erasing us." That same week, garbage collection skipped their property. Twice. Then the electricity meter outside their house began blinking red, despite no outages being reported on the grid. Walter contacted the provider directly and was told there was no record of his address being active. When he provided the account number, the agent hesitated and told him it had been flagged for temporary deactivation due to administrative redirection. No further explanation, no path for escalation. He hung up the phone without a word and simply sat down, calculating quietly. Someone had accessed regional systems and deliberately removed their digital presence from public infrastructure logs. Not blocked, not suspended, erased. And the only way that was possible was with administrative credentials. They were not just being punished for non-compliance. They were being digitally exterminated from the grid. When the letter came 2 days later, it no longer attempted to use neutral language. It was printed on letterhead, bearing a modified emblem of the local council. Not official, but close enough to intimidate. It accused Walter and Joan of intentional obstruction of critical infrastructure optimization and declared their property under evaluation for emergency access override. It read like a quiet prelude to property seizure, or at least temporary takeover under the guise of maintenance. Joan, reading it out loud at the kitchen table, asked, "Do they think they can just walk in and take it from us?" Walter didn't answer. He was already powering up his backup server array. But it wasn't enough to resist behind closed doors. They needed leverage. Not a blog post, not a social media campaign. Real leverage. Walter contacted his telecommunications consultant again, sharing the updated logs and evidence of state-level digital removal. Together, they traced the routing attempts that had been hammering their decoy node. What they discovered wasn't a single origin. It was a network of origin points across a dozen addresses within the same residential grid. Each one corresponded to a property owned by a development firm listed as a sponsoring entity on the council's infrastructure documentation. And among those names, one stood out: Jennings Holdings, LLC. Karen's name, buried behind corporate veils, was tied to the ownership structure of at least 4 properties, each of which contained devices nearly identical to the relay box the Grays had removed. With that confirmation, Walter and his consultant compiled a case dossier: names, addresses, routing logs, hidden network IDs, and their direct correlations to the private relay system being quietly run through the neighborhood. The entire setup was a shell operation disguised as a smart neighborhood initiative, with homes like theirs being used as digital bridges without disclosure. What they had uncovered wasn't just overreach, it was covert infrastructure theft. And now they had names. They sent the report directly to the digital infrastructure auditor who had previously visited the house. It was accompanied by a formal legal filing through their attorney, including a notice of claim for digital trespass, misrepresentation of contractual terms, and malicious administrative targeting. Walter's tone wasn't emotional. It was clinical. The evidence was irrefutable, and the paper trail would implicate every connected property and individual behind it. They weren't threatening to expose. They were demanding resolution, with consequences. What followed next confirmed everything. 2 nights later, motion-activated lights in their backyard flared to life just after midnight. Walter checked the security cameras and saw 2 individuals in maintenance uniforms approaching the utility panel near the property's edge. They weren't neighborhood employees. They weren't even trying to hide. One carried a tablet scanning devices. The other held tools. Walter didn't confront them. He activated the system override, locking down the panel and initiating a silent alert to their attorney's office. By the time the intruders realized they couldn't access the panel, they were already being recorded from 5 angles, every step documented. They left quickly, and the next morning, Walter forwarded the footage with a timestamp and coordinates to the auditing agency, legal counsel, and the State Utilities Commission. The pressure escalated quickly after that. Karen reappeared at their door, not with a letter but in person. Dressed sharply, flanked by two silent men in matching blazers, she stood on their porch with her usual smile strained by underlying tension. She didn't offer pleasantries. She asked flatly, "Are you willing to cooperate, or do we have to escalate this to the next level?" Walter, calm as ever, simply replied, "Your network is no longer operational. You'll have to find a new bridge." Karen's face shifted, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second into something sharper, colder. She said nothing more. She turned and walked away. That same day, the Greys' access to utility systems was fully restored. Their gallery platform reinstated Jones' account without explanation. And then, without warning, a regional news outlet posted a quiet but damning report on its website about illegal signal redirection within residential neighborhoods tied to undeclared business entities. It didn't name names, but the implications were clear to anyone who knew where to look. The Greys didn't contact the press. They didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself, and the walls that had closed in around them began to crack. Not from shouting or confrontation, but from the one thing their enemies had not counted on: precision. The culmination came not in the form of a final confrontation, but as a chain reaction of collapsing lies and scrambled responses from a system that had never expected to be challenged so effectively. Days after Karen Jennings's last visit, the neighborhood management office went dark. Its automated phone line stopped answering, its website redirected to a placeholder, and its local office, which Joan passed every few days on errands, now sat, closed behind tinted windows. A handwritten "Maintenance in Progress" sign hung crookedly on the glass, though no activity occurred behind it. The silence this time was different. It wasn't strategic or intimidating. It was panicked, as if those who had pulled the strings had suddenly lost their grip and were retreating into the shadows, unsure of what had been exposed and what was still hidden. Walter, tracking server activity through his now heavily encrypted sandbox, watched as the last remaining signals that had once tried to probe his network simply stopped. No more forced entries, no more ping attempts, no more scanning behavior. But it wasn't a clean break, it was abandonment. The digital infrastructure that had once leached from their property now flickered out, severed from its hidden command structure like an organism losing its central nervous system. Joan noticed it too in more subtle ways. Mail resumed on time. Packages that had once arrived late or damaged now came intact. Neighbors who had once looked away now made careful eye contact. One even left a small plant by their front door with no note. Just a quiet gesture of solidarity from someone who had likely been watching, silently thankful that someone else had done what they hadn't dared. Then came the knock. Not from a neighbor or official, but from two representatives from the State Infrastructure Oversight Committee, this time accompanied by a third man who introduced himself as a federal compliance auditor, specializing in unauthorized telecommunications routing. They had received not only the Greys' documentation, but matching reports from other homeowners across multiple counties. Walter let them in, guided them again through the remnants of the embedded relay system, showed them updated routing logs, then stepped aside as they conducted their own scans. The lead auditor, a reserved man with sharp eyes and no patience for wasted time, didn't ask many questions. He simply reviewed, verified, and documented. Joan watched from the living room, arms folded, her expression unreadable. She had long since passed the point of anger. This was the part where professionals did their job, where wrongdoing was converted into violations, and where those who had hidden behind technical jargon and bureaucratic shields would finally be forced into the open. 3 days later, Walter received confirmation that a full state investigation had been launched, with subpoenas issued to Jennings Holdings, LLC, and 2 partner firms tied to real estate development in the region. The charges listed were broad, but the key phrase stood out: unauthorized data infrastructure installation and operation on private residential properties without informed consent. It wasn't just a fine or a slap on the wrist, it was a direct accusation of illegal network manipulation across state lines. The consequences would be financial, legal, and reputational. Walter had no interest in watching the fallout unfold. He wasn't here for justice in the theatrical sense. He was here to secure peace. But before that peace could settle, one last signal came through. Not digital, but physical. A car parked outside their home late in the evening, engine idling with its lights off. Walter, cautious but prepared, watched from the second-floor window, noting the plates, the make, and model. After 10 minutes, the driver exited, A woman, not Karen, but someone younger, dressed in corporate casual, holding a thin envelope. She didn't approach the door. Instead, she walked to the mailbox, opened it, placed the envelope inside, and drove off without a glance back. Inside the envelope was a letter on blank paper. No letterhead, no signature. It contained only a single paragraph. What you uncovered was not meant for you. Walk away. You won't hear from us again. There were no threats, no demands, just a closing statement written like a ceasefire. Walter read it once, then handed it to Joan. She scanned it, then set it down and said nothing. They didn't need to respond. The message was irrelevant. The network was already gone, the evidence already processed, and the system already exposed. Whatever they had stumbled into, be it a rogue initiative, an exploitative pilot program, or something less structured but more dangerous, it was over, at least in the way it had once operated. Their home was once again theirs in every sense. But it wasn't victory they celebrated, it was recovery. Walter began quietly wiping and replacing every piece of hardware that had once been connected to the compromised system. Reinstalling network gear, closing every vulnerability, sealing the structure not just with concrete and fiber, but with experience. Joan relaunched her gallery, this time hosted in an isolated data pod, registered under a completely new entity. They didn't talk about what had happened to many others. They didn't need to. What had been intended as a quiet home for two people had been turned into the heart of a shadow system, and then reclaimed piece by piece by those same two people who never wanted to fight but refused to surrender. The aftermath didn't make headlines. There were no public hearings, no viral exposés. But the silence that followed wasn't oppressive this time, it was earned. Walter and Joan didn't seek to control the neighborhood. They didn't file lawsuits for money or push to unseat Karen Jennings from whatever false throne she had claimed. Their victory was in what had not been taken. Their name, their home, their digital identity. They had held the line, and now, finally, they could breathe. Months passed. The season shifted, bringing cooler winds and longer shadows across the quiet streets of the neighborhood. For Walter and Joan Gray, life didn't return to what it had been. It evolved into something sharper, calmer, and more defined. Their home remained the same structure from the outside, but inside every system had been rebuilt from the ground up. New wiring, independent servers, no reliance on shared utilities. Walter had taken the experience and converted it into architecture. The house no longer just sheltered them. It protected them, passively monitoring every digital pulse without broadcasting anything in return. Joan resumed her work without ceremony. Her gallery, restructured, flourished under new security protocols and a renewed sense of authorship. She no longer entertained the idea of outreach or neighborhood engagement. She didn't need praise nor validation. The peace they had reclaimed was its own form of reward. Neighbors continued to keep their distance, but now it was a quiet respect, not avoidance. Some nodded as they passed. Others simply looked away, uncertain whether to treat the Grays as allies, survivors, or simply people who had seen something they shouldn't have. Karen Jennings was no longer a presence. Her house stood with curtains drawn, porch empty, mailbox untouched. Rumors circulated about a sale, about legal troubles, about a quiet vanishing act behind closed doors. But Walter and Joan didn't ask. They weren't interested in watching the fallout. They had seen the center of the storm and walked out whole. That was enough. One subtle change lingered. A new plaque, barely noticeable, installed by Walter near the side gate. It bore no name or warning, just a custom-etched message carved into a metal plate. Private signal zone. No external relay permitted. It wasn't for deterrence, it was a boundary, like a fence that didn't need to be high to be honored. In the end, there was no victory parade, no cathartic speech, just two people in a home they had reclaimed with clarity, precision, and unwavering refusal to be used. The silence they lived in now wasn't empty. It was intentional, and it was finally theirs.